And I shall insist on the right to have as many love affairs as I please.
The wind off Catalina Island was soft that night, more a whisper than a gale. Yet something about it carried unease. The waters shimmered black, broken only by the dull rocking of Splendor, the 60-foot yacht moored just off the shore. It was November 28th, 1981, a Saturday. Somewhere around midnight, a scream was heard across the water, high, sharp, then gone. The woman who screamed would be found floating hours later, face down in a flannel nightgown, socks still clinging to her feet. A down jacket ballooned around her shoulders like a tragic sail. Natalie Wood was 43, beautiful, famous, fragile, an actress beloved for the way her eyes could hold both hope and devastation in a single frame. Now, her eyes would never open again. Inside the boat, someone turned off the music. The night was supposed to be a getaway, a simple Thanksgiving weekend trip with her husband, Robert Wagner, their guest, Christopher Walken, and the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern. But nothing about the voyage would remain simple. The sea was calm. There were no storms, no witnesses of her fall. Only questions that washed ashore with her body the next morning. Natalie had disappeared sometime after 11 p.m. No one saw her leave. No one heard her return. The ship's dinghy, the small inflatable boat tethered to the yacht, was also gone, found later beached not far from her remains. But there was something wrong with the story from the beginning. Those who knew Natalie knew her fear deep, paralyzing. Childhood rooted a terror of dark water. She wouldn't go near it alone, not at night, not in socks. As the sun broke over Avalon Harbor, the illusion of calm unraveled. First responders arrived. Press soon followed. The world woke to headlines that felt like mistakes. Actress Natalie Wood dies in boating accident. But already the whispers began, rumors swirling beneath the surface like unseen currents. The first reports called it tragic but accidental. She must have slipped, maybe trying to secure the dinghy, maybe climbing into it, despite the pitch-black water and her own fear of drowning. But then came the inconsistencies, the bruises, the timing, the silence, and most of all, the unanswered scream. Was it hers? Years later, one of the yacht's neighbors, a woman anchored nearby, would recall hearing it. "Help me. Someone please help me." It came twice, she said, then stopped. When she looked toward Splendor, all she saw was a boat bobbing gently on still water, its lights low, its secrets quiet. There is something about water that absorbs the truth. It reflects the surface, but keeps what lies beneath. On the island, the bars closed early that Sunday. The harbor emptied out. But that small cove, where the actress vanished, stayed exactly as it was that night. Quiet, watchful, suspended in a kind of tragic hush. The dinghy floated alone, as if it too had heard something it couldn't unhear. There's a moment just before dawn, where everything feels unreal, like the world is deciding whether to wake up or turn away. Natalie's body was found in that moment at 7:44 a.m. by a sheriff's deputy, who would later say he'd never forget her hands. Pale, soft, still curled slightly, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Boats are like rooms on the water, confined, close, echoing spaces where nothing really goes unnoticed. And yet, on Splendor, something vanished without sound, without witness, without a trace of struggle anyone wanted to speak of. It was the beginning of the end and the start of a mystery that would never find its harbor. Long before the night off Catalina, Natalie Wood had been falling, not visibly, not to the public, to them. She was a star that never dulled an eternal ingenue, luminous since childhood, gliding from one silver screen triumph to another. She was Maria in West Side Story, the haunted daughter in Rebel Without a Cause, the little girl who heard Santa in Miracle on 34th Street. Her beauty was so precise, it often seemed sculpted for the camera, large brown eyes filled with yearning. Vulnerability cupped beneath glamour, but beneath the makeup and the press smiles, Natalie carried fractures. She once described herself, softly, as someone always frightened, of water, of the dark, of being alone, of being unloved. Her mother, Maria Zakharenko, was a woman of fierce ambitions and flickering superstitions. Natalie's earliest years were steered by omens and studio contracts, not lullabies. Her mother told her often of the fortune teller who had said Natalie would die in dark water, and so began a lifetime of fear. Showers over baths, boats only with others. Even pools could make her breath quicken. But Hollywood doesn't stop for fears. It rewards illusion, and Natalie, taught to smile through anxiety, became an expert at pretending everything was fine. Her first marriage to Robert Wagner began in 1957. It was a media fairy tale America's sweetheart weds handsome television star. They divorced 5 years later. Then, as if completing a tragic arc, remarried in 1972. People called it romantic. Natalie called it something else in private: complicated, necessary, familiar. By the 1980s, she was in a fragile rebirth, older than the roles she once filled, but not yet ready to vanish. Brainstorm, the science fiction film she had been working on with Christopher Walken, was meant to mark a new phase. She wanted to be seen again, not as the tragic girl, but as a woman of depth, capable of the roles Hollywood denied women past 35, on the yacht Splendor during that Thanksgiving weekend. She tried to enjoy it. She smiled, posed for photos, poured wine. But she wasn't at ease. Those closest to her said she seemed distant. She called her therapist from the island. She spoke of unease, of arguments. Something about the trip had turned brittle. Something felt off. A waiter who served the group at Doug's Harbor Reef restaurant that evening remembered the tension. The air around them was tight. Wagner looked brooding. Natalie appeared quiet. Walken seemed like a guest overstaying comfort. When Natalie drank, she became softer, more open, but also more restless. That night, the wine flowed freely, as did the arguments. Later, someone would say it sounded like glass breaking aboard the boat. Others would deny hearing anything at all. Natalie had always longed for something she couldn't name. She once told a friend, "I don't want to live in a world without love." But the love she knew often carried thorns, jealousy, possessiveness, long silences over crowded dinner tables. She had tried to leave Wagner once before. She had come back. The heart, like the sea, has tides stronger than logic. There is a photograph taken just hours before her death. Natalie on the deck of Splendor, her hair caught by the wind, eyes unfocused, mouth neither smiling nor frowning. It is not a posed photo. It is, in its way, a silent portrait of someone not quite present, a swan drifting just out of reach. She was afraid of the ocean. That much is known. She had told friends and doctors. She had written it in her diary. Water was always the shadow at her heels. Why then, on that calm but moonless night, would she leave the safety of the cabin, step onto a wet deck in nightgown and socks, and climb into a dinghy alone? There are stories, and there is truth. Natalie Wood was someone who lived between the two, crafted into image, shaped by scripts, pulled between devotion and dread. That night, as the harbor's lights blinked quietly on the horizon, the woman who had been everyone's dream girl looked out into darkness. She once said that the scariest thing in life is not being heard, and yet, her last moments would be defined by silence. When the Splendor slipped into the water that holiday weekend, it carried more than just passengers. It carried histories, long and knotted ones, and tensions, invisible but taut, like mooring ropes on a drifting dock. Robert Wagner, Natalie's husband, was a handsome figure of old Hollywood charming, disciplined, the kind of man who wore a blazer even on boats. Their love story had been public, broken, and stitched back together again. To outsiders, it seemed like fate. To those who knew them, it was something more fragile. Two people bound by deep affection, deeper insecurities, and a fear of being alone. Then there was Christopher Walken, unconventional, magnetic, a strange elegance wrapped in detachment. Natalie's co-star on Brainstorm. Walken was younger, cerebral, enigmatic. Rumors had swirled that there was chemistry between them, not necessarily romantic, but something that ignited Wagner's unease. And finally, Dennis Davern, the boat's captain. Loyal, quiet, and uncomfortably observant. He had served the couple for years, knew their arguments, knew what floated above and what dragged beneath. The four of them were sealed together on the water. No cameras, no press, just the tide and their own fraying tensions. Dinner that night, Saturday, had been held at Doug's Harbor Reef. Locals remembered them arriving late, voices already raised. The atmosphere at the table was uneasy. Wagner drank heavily. Natalie and Walken spoke in hushed tones. Their laughter, if it came at all, never quite reached their eyes. Later, back aboard the Splendor, the drinking didn't stop. It deepened. Wagner poured more wine. Walken talked about career and ambition, about Natalie's future in film, and, according to Davern's later account, Wagner snapped. There was shouting, accusations, something about how Natalie was too focused on her career, something about Walken's influence, words that landed like broken glass. Davern recalled Wagner smashing a wine bottle, its sharp sound slicing the night. Natalie fled to her cabin. Walken retreated to his. Davern lingered in the salon, uncertain, uncomfortable. And Wagner. He disappeared down the hall toward his wife's door. What followed is fractured. Every account is different. Wagner would later say he and Natalie had a small argument, but that when he checked on her later, she was gone. He assumed she had taken the dinghy to shore something implausible, and something Davern quietly disputed. Walken never spoke in detail. His silence became part of the fog. Davern, decades later, would offer a different tale that he heard Wagner and Natalie arguing in their cabin. Voices sharp and then muffled, followed by silence. He said Wagner waited hours before calling for help, that the mood turned cold, that the timeline didn't match what was said publicly. There were 3 men on that boat when Natalie disappeared. None of them jumped in to look for her. None of them called the Coast Guard until hours after she vanished. No flares, no distress signals, just a late, hushed phone call from shore. At 1:30 a.m., the dinghy was reported missing. By 5:00 a.m., the harbor patrol was involved, and at 7:44 a.m., Natalie's body was found, drifting face down in a cove not far from where Splendor had floated all night. She was wearing her nightgown, socks, a red down jacket, waterlogged like sorrow. There is an old superstition among sailors: red on the water is an omen. Some say it means lost love. Others say it means silence that can never be retrieved. For years, the official line held Natalie must have tried to tie up the dinghy, slipped, and fallen in. But the truth of that theory rests on a delicate hope that she terrified of water, wearing bedroom clothes, and after a bitter argument, chose to brave the night sea alone. And none of the 3 men on board could explain why. There's a detail often overlooked: the bottle, broken in anger, wine dripping like blood onto the teak floor. Was it a metaphor, or something more? Did it mark a line crossed? Was the noise it made louder than the splash they claimed not to hear? 3 men were on that boat. 3 men, all awake, all aware, all silent. The sea, patient and impassive, took what it was given and left behind a mystery tethered only by memory, contradiction, and the scent of wine that never fully faded from the cabin walls. In the early light of that Sunday morning, the dinghy was found calmly bobbing in the surf, almost as if waiting to be claimed. It was intact. The motor was off. No signs of damage, no scratches on the hull. Just a small, inflatable boat, resting on the edge of the rocks near Blue Cavern Point, as though it had drifted to shore on its own accord. Natalie Wood's body had been discovered less than a mile away. The official story leaned hard on this detail. Natalie, for reasons never fully explained, attempted to leave Splendor that night, stepping into the dinghy alone, in darkness, wearing her nightgown, a thick red parka, and wool socks. Perhaps to tie it down. Perhaps to escape the tension aboard. Perhaps, though unlikely, to go ashore. And somehow, she slipped. But something didn't add up. First, the night. The temperature had dropped below 50 degrees, cold by Southern California standards, colder still for someone in sleepwear. The water itself hovered around 58 degrees, frigid enough to steal breath from even the strongest swimmer within minutes. Natalie, petite and exhausted from alcohol, would have stood little chance. Second, her clothing, a nightgown, not a robe, a down jacket, heavy enough to drag, wool socks, known to become slippery on fiberglass decks. These were not garments for escape, or for braving cold seawater. They were garments for comfort, or for retreating inside oneself, for curling up, not for climbing out. And finally, the dinghy. If Natalie had truly fallen in while trying to board it, why was the small boat not overturned? Why was it not dragging against the side of Splendor, tethered and tangled? Instead, it was found calmly ashore, neatly idle, as if placed. Investigators noted that the ignition key was in the off position. The oars were stowed properly. There were no signs of struggle, no broken lines or snapped hardware. It didn't look like an accident. It looked like someone had untied it carefully, used it or made it seem used and let it drift. Water tells lies through stillness. It preserves silence like a tomb. The first detectives on scene made basic assumptions. No foul play. A drunken misstep. A tragic but plausible scenario, written with the ink of grief. But underneath that narrative was a troubling fact. Natalie had spoken often of her fear of water. She could swim, but barely. She never liked to. And above all else, she never went near boats at night, especially alone. Her sister, Lana Wood, would later recall Natalie's childhood terror, how she would panic near pools, how she would lock the bathroom door when bathing, how she once said, "The only thing I'm truly afraid of is dark water." Friends confirmed this. Therapists knew. Even Robert Wagner knew. It was not a minor phobia. It was lifelong, obsessive, irrational. It ruled her choices. Why, then, would she choose to step into the void? There was another detail. A shattered bottle of wine found below deck. Its contents pooled in a rug, red as rust, staining the floorboards. The bottle's neck jagged like a weapon. This moment, this broken thing sat quietly in the police report, referenced once, never followed, and in the corner of Natalie's bedroom. Her suitcase was half-packed. The symbolism of it all is too much to ignore a woman in flight, a boat adrift, a scream that no one claimed to hear. She had once told a close friend that the sound of water slapping wood at night made her feel like she was being followed, as if something was just beneath the surface, waiting to pull her under. The dinghy was eventually towed and examined. No forensic evidence changed the story, but the narrative cracks widened. A woman afraid of water, angry with her husband, no shoes, no light, slips quietly into the night to untie a boat. It never fit. Not really. There was no note, no explanation, just the soft plop of the sea. the slap of the tide against hull, and then emptiness. Natalie Wood disappeared in that silence, and the dinghy, like a ghostly decoy, drifted its way to shore, mute and obedient. In the crime scene photos, it rests quietly, nose tilted toward the beach, as though it knew the way. And in the minds of many, it became the first witness mute, but damning. Sometimes, the smallest vessel carries the heaviest truths. For years, Dennis Davern said almost nothing. He was the man closest to the truth, Splendor's captain, a trusted presence aboard the Wagner's yacht for many voyages. He cooked their meals, kept the engine humming, poured the drinks, and cleaned up after the long, wine-heavy nights. In the wake of Natalie Wood's death, he gave the statements expected of him. He told investigators she must have gone out to secure the dinghy. He told them Robert Wagner had been distraught. He told them he didn't know what had really happened. But that version, tidy, obedient, wasn't the whole story. It would take decades for his conscience to speak louder than his loyalty. And when it did, the silence that once protected Robert Wagner began to fray. In 2011, 30 years after Natalie's death, Davern publicly recanted much of what he had initially told authorities. On national television, and later in a book, he admitted he had lied out of fear, lied to protect Wagner, lied because in the strange hierarchy aboard that boat, truth was something one didn't offer freely. It had to be allowed. Davern painted a very different picture of that night. According to his revised account, the tension between Natalie and Wagner wasn't mild. It was a storm waiting to break. After returning from the restaurant, the fight had been immediate. Not drunken banter, but cold fury. Wagner accusing Natalie of flirting with Walken, Natalie slamming a wine glass on the table. The kind of fight where silence becomes louder than shouting. Davern said he watched Wagner smash a wine bottle deliberately during a jealous outburst. Walken, uncomfortable, retreated to his cabin. Natalie moved to hers, but the arguing didn't stop. Davern recalled pacing the deck, listening to muffled voices rising through the teak walls, and then nothing. He didn't hear Natalie fall. He didn't hear a splash, but he remembered the silence that followed felt unnatural, stretched thin and taut like the stillness before a scream. And then Wagner emerged, pale, cold, and according to Davern, he whispered a single, terrifying thing: she's gone. No alarms were raised, no flares, no calls to the Coast Guard for at least 4 hours. Davern said he wanted to search, wanted to shine lights into the water, maybe dive in himself, but Wagner told him not to. He ordered the captain to wait for daylight, wait for someone else to find her. That command haunted Davern for decades. When Natalie's body was pulled from the water the next morning, Wagner wept for the cameras. Davern stood beside him, holding back everything he knew: the wine, the bottle, the silence, the command to stay quiet. His guilt, he later said, was like a knot that wouldn't come undone. When Davern finally spoke out, he wasn't believed by all. Some said it was opportunism. Others said too much time had passed. But the authorities listened. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case in 2011, reclassifying Natalie's death from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. It was a quiet yet seismic shift. Suddenly, the case had no closure. Wagner, once treated only as a grieving husband, was named a person of interest, not a suspect, not charged, but no longer untouched by suspicion. Davern's new version raised the stakes, but it also raised the question, why did he wait so long? Fear, perhaps. Wagner was powerful, connected. He had protected Davern's livelihood. But more than that, the boat itself had been a kind of stage. And on that stage, Davern had been cast in a supporting role meant to be silent, unseen, disposable. After Natalie's death, he never captained another boat. He drank more, faded from the spotlight. And as the years passed, the weight of what wasn't said began to suffocate. There's something mournful about delayed truth. It arrives out of time, stripped of its sharpest edge, yet it still wounds. In one interview, Davern said, "I don't think she had to die. Just 7 words, soft, unsteady." But behind them lay 3 decades of haunted silence. The captain who once steered Splendor was now steering the narrative in a different direction. But whether he was too late, or finally right on time, remains as uncertain as everything else about that night. And in the shadow of his confession, the boat itself silent, gleaming, floating just off Catalina, began to resemble something else entirely. A floating room with no windows, and too many secrets left inside. It began, as many stories do in Hollywood, with a look across a crowded room. Natalie was 18. Wagner was 22. Both beautiful, both rising. Their paths first crossed at a studio party. 2 screen idols in the making, carefully curated by agents and columnists, like stars aligned on a publicist's wish list. Their romance, swift and staged at first, evolved into something deeper, but never quite safe. By 1957, they were married, the golden couple of a silver age. The photographs from that time are impossibly polished, Natalie in white gloves, Wagner in a slim-cut tuxedo, both smiling beneath the flashbulbs, his hand always on the small of her back. But even in those images, something wavers. Natalie's smile is often soft, unfinished. His jaw, tense. There's affection, yes, but also ownership. The marriage didn't last. They divorced in 1962 after 5 years of brittle passion, infidelity, ambition, long absences. It wasn't a sudden fracture, but a slow erosion, the kind that begins with misunderstandings and ends with slammed doors. Yet despite everything, they remained orbiting each other. Lovers, then exes, then, strangely, something in between. Natalie once said, "The only time I ever felt whole was with our J. And so, 10 years after their split, she married him again. The second marriage was quieter, more private. They had a daughter, Courtney, blended families, peaceful photographs. But the old wounds were never fully dressed. Jealousy lingered in the corners like smoke. Natalie, always luminous, drew attention. Wagner, once the star, had watched his spotlight flicker. His career was steady, but hers was stormier when she succeeded. It made headlines. When she floundered, it made gossip. There were stories of late-night arguments, of Wagner checking hotel phones for messages, of Natalie confiding in friends about his possessiveness, how he could turn cold with alarming speed. And yet, she returned to him, again and again, as if drawn by the idea of who they had been, or might still become. By 1981, the year of her death, their marriage was a house carefully swept, but with cracks in the foundation. Christopher Walken entered that fragile architecture like a ghost. Not deliberate, not romantic, at least not openly, but catalytic. Natalie admired him, his seriousness, his talent, the way he moved through scenes like a man only half tethered to the world. They shared long days on set, private conversations between takes. She once told a friend he made her feel seen again. Wagner noticed, on Splendor, that final night. The air was thick with unspoken things. Walken's presence was not unwelcome, but it wasn't neutral either. Wagner watched his wife laugh too long at something Walken said, watched their bodies lean too close at dinner, watched as the man who wasn't him pulled Natalie's attention across the table. It was the kind of evening where everything is slightly out of place. The wrong wine, the wrong words, the wrong mood, until finally, it tips. According to later testimony, Walken and Wagner argued about Natalie's future. Walken encouraged her to act more, to chase the bigger, braver roles. Wagner snapped. He believed family came first. And beneath that disagreement ran something older, deeper fear. that he was being replaced, not just in her career, but in her affections. Jealousy is a slow poison. It doesn't shout at watches, it waits. And then, suddenly, it acts. After Natalie stormed to her cabin that night, Wagner followed. What was said behind that closed door, no one can say for certain. But the next time she was seen, it was not by anyone aboard the Splendor. It was by a patrol officer, hours later, floating face down in the cold Pacific. In the days following her death, Wagner remained publicly composed. He released statements, attended the funeral with dark glasses, hugged their children, but he refused to speak to detectives beyond the initial questioning. He never returned to the boat, and he never publicly addressed the fight that had rattled through its narrow halls that night. Natalie's marriage was a mirror one that shimmered with devotion, but fractured easily. It held two people trapped in a myth they helped build, that love was enough to forgive everything, even fear. The ocean doesn't forgive. It takes what is dropped into it and keeps it. That night, off Catalina, the mirror cracked again, but this time, there was no repairing it, only reflections, scattered in salt water and silence. The official cause of Natalie Wood's death was decided quickly: accidental drowning. The original report read no ambiguity, no foul play suspected. The autopsy noted numerous bruises, abrasions, and a small scrape on her cheek, but attributed them to the roughness of the water, the banging of her body against the dinghy, the rocks, perhaps the yacht itself. It was tidy, tragic, acceptable for a while. But documents, like bodies, sometimes tell stories in whispers. And this report, quiet, medical, unemotional, never quite silenced the unease it tried to contain. There were questions that lived between the lines. Why had no one heard a splash? Why were the bruises fresh, in places difficult to explain? Why had the autopsy not definitively ruled on time of death, given the coldness of the water and the rigidity of her limbs? And why did the dinghy, in its pristine stillness, offer no evidence that she'd fallen into it or tried to climb aboard? Natalie's body had over 24 bruises, some large, some faint, clustered around her arms, legs, and even her face. There was a scratch along her left cheek, a prominent abrasion on her left knee, bruising on her wrists, in isolation, perhaps all explainable. But together, they whispered of struggle. The coroner at the time, Thomas Noguchi, nicknamed Coroner to the Stars, was known for his poetic phrasing and cautious prose. His original report leaned heavily on the assumption that Natalie had attempted to secure the dinghy, slipped, and drowned. There was no water in her lungs, suggesting she was unconscious or dead when she entered the water. But this was never highlighted, never explained. The conclusion held for 3 decades until the stillness began to crack. In 2011, as Dennis Davern came forward and media pressure mounted, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the case, quietly, discreetly, but seriously. New interviews were conducted, old ones re-examined, and more importantly, the coroner's office was asked to revisit the autopsy. This time, Dr. Lakshmanan Satyavagiswaran, then chief medical examiner, took another look. What he saw unsettled him. In 2012, Natalie's death certificate was officially amended. The cause of death changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. It was a subtle but seismic shift, a statement without accusation, but not without implication. In the new report, the bruises were described as fresh and suspicious. The positioning, particularly on the front of her body, was inconsistent with a simple fall into water. And if she had hit rocks post-mortem, why were some of the wounds not in locations expected from drifting impact? The abrasion on her cheek was particularly difficult to place. Some speculated it may have come from being struck or from a sudden collision. One forensic pathologist described it, carefully, as not inconsistent with a struggle. Still, there were no witnesses, no new evidence, No camera footage, just time-stamped silence and a list of injuries that no longer fit the story written in 1981. The language of coroner's reports is exact, deliberately cold. But within the clinical detachment, symbols emerged: the bruised wrists, as if gripped, the facial injury, as if slapped or shoved, the knee abrasions, as if fallen. They painted, if not a picture, then at least a shadow. The ocean, once blamed for every wound, began to seem more like an accomplice than a cause. Wagner, for his part, refused to speak with investigators after the case reopened. He issued a brief statement through his lawyer. No new facts. It read, no new interviews. Walken, too, remained distant, briefly cooperating, then retreating behind his habitual reserve. But the coroner's amendment stood. It spoke not of guilt, but of doubt. Not of accusation, but of impossibility that this was not just a fall. That perhaps Natalie Wood's death had never been an accident at all. A forensic scientist later noted that in the art of death investigation, there is no such thing as coincidence, only layers of context waiting to be understood. And in Natalie's case, context came slowly, like the tide washing in years later, unearthing pieces not seen before, pieces that didn't add up. The red coat, the bruises, the delayed call, the changing stories, the silence from the boat, and in the heart of all of it, a woman afraid of water, found drowned in the very thing she feared most, with wounds that spoke louder than anyone ever had. There are fears that live in the body like old echoes, quiet but insistent, rooted in childhood, never truly outgrown. For Natalie Wood, water was one such fear. Not a passing discomfort or cinematic quirk, but something visceral. It shaped her, shadowed her, a constant undercurrent beneath the polished surface of her life. From the time she was a little girl, Natalie had told anyone who would listen she was terrified of deep water, not just drowning, but of the idea of falling into something dark and unknowable, where no one could hear her scream. It was not uncommon for her to suffer nightmares of sinking, and it wasn't melodrama, it was phobia. Her mother, superstitious and controlling, had once taken Natalie to a psychic who predicted, eerily, that she would die in dark water. A line that would ring like a curse through the rest of Natalie's life. She never forgot it. Throughout her adult years, she avoided swimming, refused to learn to dive, and hated small boats. In one interview, when asked about her deepest fear, she didn't hesitate. Water. I'm afraid of water. I can't stand to be near it in the dark. On sets, she used doubles for water scenes. In private, she sometimes cried at the idea of having to ride in open vessels. Friends and family confirmed it again and again. Lana Wood, her sister, remembered pool parties where Natalie would perch at the edge, smiling, but never joining. She could wade in the shallows, yes. But beyond that, something always stopped her. An invisible hand at her back. It made the circumstances of her death all the more cruel, and all the more suspicious, because it wasn't just that she was afraid of water. It was that she never would have chosen it. Not in a nightgown, not in socks, not alone. The dinghy scenario, long accepted by those unwilling to ask harder questions, was always out of sync with who she truly was. Why would she go up on deck, at night, in rough clothing, to untie a boat? Why would she do so barefoot, without telling anyone, after a loud argument, knowing the dangers, and if she had accidentally fallen? Why was there no cry, no splash, no frantic sounds overheard by the men aboard? Some say alcohol changes us, that it makes us reckless. Perhaps. But those who knew Natalie well insisted that even drunk, even angry, she would never have stepped into that fear willingly. There's something poignant in the detail of her attire, the flannel nightgown, the thick parka, the wool socks. Not clothes for confrontation, not clothes for running away. They are the garments of exhaustion, of emotional withdrawal, perhaps even of protection, layers against the cold, or against someone. Was she running from something, or toward it? The last verified sighting of her alive was in her cabin, alone, preparing for sleep. The argument had ceased. The lights were low. Walken was in his room. Davern in his Wagner, supposedly pacing. And then, a gap, a void where time should be. Natalie was no stranger to emotional complexity. She had lived long in its chambers. But there is a difference between vulnerability and self-harm, between seeking solace and stepping into terror. Everything about that night, every object, every bruise, every silence points away from choice. Fear is a kind of map. It tells us where the lines are drawn. Natalie's fear of water wasn't symbolic. It was tangible. It ruled her instincts. And that night, those instincts should have kept her inside, curled beneath blankets, waiting for morning. But instead, she ended up in the water she had spent her life avoiding. There's a phrase Natalie once used in a magazine profile: "I've been afraid of things my whole life, but I still have to face them." She was speaking about acting, but it reads now like a confession, or perhaps a warning. What happens when the thing you fear most finds you? When it wears the face of something familiar, somewhere, between the cabin walls and the ocean's edge. That fear caught up with her, and the sea, deep and dark and merciless, swallowed what no one else would say aloud. Hollywood knows how to bury its ghosts. It builds them into backlots, buries them beneath fresh premieres, rebrands them with soft interviews and studio apologies. And when one of its own dies under a cloud of mystery, the spotlight dims not out of grief, but out of design. Natalie Wood's death was no exception. From the very beginning, the machinery of fame moved to control the narrative. Within hours of her body being pulled from the Pacific, studio publicists and entertainment lawyers were already crafting statements, shielding reputations, and urging restraint. Wagner, heartbroken but high profile, was handled delicately. There were no harsh questions, no subpoenas, just sadness and silence and complicity. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office accepted the initial story without pressing. Davern's early statement brief, edited. Uncritical was filed, stamped, and set aside. Walken, protected by his own discomfort and a team of agents, was questioned only once. His lawyer reportedly instructed him to say as little as possible. Behind closed doors, many in Hollywood whispered their doubts. But the whispers never made it to print. Natalie had been one of them. A child star, a contract player, a box office icon. She had grown up within the studio system. She knew its rules: image over intimacy, silence over scandal. And Wagner was part of that world, too. He was polished, respected, well-liked. He had friends in every corner of the industry. And more importantly, he had money. There was no appetite for disruption. When the Splendor returned to harbor without Natalie, it wasn't swarmed by police. It was quietly docked. No forensic team dusted the dinghy. No photographs were taken of the deck's layout. No timeline of events was written in full. The story of her disappearance was accepted almost immediately. No cross-examinations, no confrontations. It was a death treated more like a delicate inconvenience than a potential crime. Reporters were discouraged. Photographers were redirected. The studio behind Brainstorm, Natalie's final film, issued condolences and pressed forward with post-production, a week after her funeral. Wagner resumed work. Walken flew east. The industry moved on, as it always does. Over the bruises of its brightest stars, Natalie had died under mysterious circumstances, but she was also a woman. And in the 1980s, the machinery of male power, fame, and wealth often decided which questions were worth asking. It didn't help that Natalie herself had learned the language of silence. She had grown up playing the game, smiling when asked about roles she hated, downplaying injuries on set, brushing off rumors of marital trouble. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that truth was rarely profitable. In the years that followed, friends were careful. They spoke of her warmth, her laughter, her beauty, but not of her bruises, not of the cold arguments, not of the psychic who predicted her death in water. That story was always tucked just out of reach, like a line from a forgotten script. Only her sister, Lana, refused to play by the rules. For decades, she pressed for answers, forensics, witness accounts. She appeared on shows, wrote books, demanded that anyone be made to answer for what happened. She wasn't interested in blame. She wanted truth. But Hollywood isn't built for truth. It's built for illusion. There is a phrase often used in industry circles: protect the brand. And Wagner, Natalie, and the myth of their tragic romance was a brand. Too valuable, too iconic, too fragile to dissect, so the silence remained. When the case was reopened in 2011, it wasn't because someone came forward. It was because time had made the silence suspicious. The inconsistencies too loud to ignore, the bruises too many, the timelines too thin, and the captain, finally willing to speak, was no longer young, no longer afraid. But even then, Wagner declined to cooperate. Walken said nothing. No charges were filed. Hollywood's code of silence had done its job. It didn't erase the questions, but it ensured no answers would be easy to find. And beneath it all, Natalie's story was reduced to a footnote, a cautionary tale, a beauty lost too soon. Yet in that code, in its omissions, its edits, its rehearsed sorrow was a truth louder than any scream. The silence around Natalie Wood was not accidental. It was orchestrated, like the closing scene of a tragic film. Her story faded to black before the truth could reach the screen. Off the coast of Catalina Island, the fog still rolls in without warning. It curls over the waves like memory gentle, white, obscuring the edges of what's real. Somewhere in that same fog, 40 years ago, Natalie Wood vanished, not only from the world, but from her own story. What remains is not clarity, but questions drifting, refracted, unresolved. The facts, as we know them, do not form a straight line. They circle, like tides, four people on a yacht, a night of wine, of tension, of argument, a scream that may have been heard, a dinghy found adrift, a body pulled from the cold Pacific in a red parka and flannel gown, and three men each with a version of the night that never quite aligns. In the years since her death, every new piece of information has only deepened the haze. The case remains technically open. Robert Wagner, now in his 90s, is still a person of interest, though he has never been charged. He has refused further interviews. In his autobiography, he called that night an accident and claimed that Natalie had gone out to adjust the dinghy. Nothing more. She slipped. He wrote, "That's all." But all was never enough. The bruises, the delay in calling for help, the inconsistencies in timing, the long silences, these are not the footprints of an accident. They are the residues of something more complex, something closer to sorrow, or guilt, or fear. Natalie's grave in Westwood Memorial Park is modest, understated. It bears no epitaph, just her name, her years, and a date that ends too early. But people still come. They leave flowers, whisper. They remember her not just as a movie star, but as a woman who carried too many ghosts and left too many behind. There is a haunting symmetry to her life and death. A child forced into fame. A young woman molded into roles that reflected other people's dreams. An adult searching for a voice, but never quite escaping the hands that shaped her. Natalie once said in an interview, "I was never allowed to grow into my own shape. I was always a version of someone else's idea." It's a line that aches in retrospect. Because even in death, the idea of Natalie remains sculpted by press releases, official records, conspiracy theories, documentaries, and whispered doubts. But the woman herself, what she feared, what she fought for, what she saw in those final moments is gone. The sea took her. In many ways, she became what she always feared, a symbol, a caution, a myth wrapped in mystery. The fog is not just literal, it's emotional. It's the fog of memory, of conflicting testimonies, of old loyalties and old wounds. It's the kind of fog that blurs responsibility, that allows the powerful to step away without consequence, that asks the public to move on without knowing. It asks, most of all, for silence. But silence has its limits. It leaves behind a scream that some remember hearing, a captain who waited too long, a timeline that doesn't hold, a face bruised in ways that no tide could explain, and perhaps the cruelest fog of all, the one that keeps her daughters wondering, not just how their mother died, but who, truly, she had been. Because Natalie Wood was more than what was written about her. She was fragile, yes, but also fierce. She was frightened, but also brave. She lived a life trapped between control and chaos, between image and intimacy. And in the end, she disappeared in the one element she feared most, water. Not in a cinematic blaze, but in a soft fall. A scream muffled by distance, a ripple erased by time. Sometimes, the sea keeps its secrets. Sometimes, people help it do so. But even now, after decades, the question lingers brittle as a wine glass about to crack. Did Natalie Wood fall into the water, or was she pushed?